dilemma. The fundamental problem, in my view, Mr. Chairman, is that this government has to, at some point, find its way to the path of reform without thinking that that's a zero-sum game, that it's not afraid to undertake the kind of reforms that would bring peace and prosperity and democracy to the country. Other autocratic regimes have done this. South Korea did it, South Africa did it, Spain did it, Indonesia did it. Right now, there are some people in the government of Sudan who recognize this. There are a lot of people who don't or don't want to or think the task is too great, the risks are too great. So what do? Where's our role in this? We have leverage. We have leverage because of sanctions. As you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, it's a big issue for the government of Sudan. But sanctions are only leverage if they're not static, if they're used, if they're part of a process. Now, I realize that, as you pointed out, and I know our witnesses, very, very knowledgeable people, will indicate the imperfections not only in the situation, but the limitation of the tracks that you mentioned. We're talking about, I won't comment on the intelligence one, I don't have the information on that. The Lord's Resistance Army, unfortunately, both Uganda and the United States are pulling back on that. But the two that are most controversial are the limited amount of progress on humanitarian access and the peace process, the ceasefires. But I look at this differently. I look at this as a very limited opening of a dialogue. We haven't had a dialogue on these issues since 2013. They closed it off after the end of the South Sudan independence. And the administration had to work hard to open it. It's limited on both ends. It isn't a big roadmap all the way to perfect relations. We've tried that in the past. Too difficult, too complicated, too many variables. It starts limited, 5 tracks that have a lot of limitations, but the sanctions are also limited that are being lifted. Yes, they open up some trade and they do a number of things, but they're not going to lead to a lot of investment in South Sudan. There's too many variables. It doesn't include debt relief. It doesn't include state sponsor of terrorism. It doesn't include all the legislative sanctions which are in place. So it's limited on both ends, and the Sudanese can know that too. So the question is, where do we go with this dialogue? Obviously, you want them to at least perform on the 5 tracks that are put out there. But the big question, which you raised, Mr. Chairman, and others have talked about, is how do you get to the other issues, the human rights issues, the real peace process issues? And that, to me, is what we should be working on for past July, whether they hopefully make these, and what comes next, and what degree of sanctions additional, otherwise one might move. It has to include human rights and freedom of assembly. It has to open that door to dialogue and further work on the peace process. I'll just make 2 other points. We forget the role of the opposition. They're players here, and they control the agenda as well. The Darfur opposition is in disarray. Its leaders are all in Paris. The SPLM North is having a split. They have put restrictions on humanitarian access that I do not find logical. They are part of the process. They have to agree to cooperate as well. And I think we have to give attention to them and what their positions are, listen very carefully because they have a right to be suspicious, but at the same time question where we think they're wrong. I would make one other recommendation, Mr. Chairman. We have a lot of restrictions on our U.S. aid program in Sudan. You can work in humanitarian areas. Its development areas are only along the border in very limited areas. Supposing you gave U.S. aid a little more freedom, a little more flexibility, so that these sanctions, which allow more medicine, more agricultural inputs to come in, they could partner with NGOs in Sudan and other groups, make sure that those goods are getting out to clinics in the outer area, getting out to farmers outside. They don't get concentrated at the center. So we're opening up the economic system. At the same time, we're opening up a little of the political system. So I see this as a first step an opening, it's part of a dialogue, it's going to be a long way to go, it's more like Burma than others, and I think in that sense, I think it's the right move, even though it's fraught with all of the problems you raised. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And without objection, all of your full statements and anything you want to attach to it will be made a part of the record.